So, just about a minute ago, Donald Trump went on Truth Social and described Canada's dairy industry as a disgrace. He argued that Canadian dairy farmers are protected by barriers so high that American farmers can barely even glimpse over them. He said the supply management system that regulates Canadian milk, cheese, butter, and poultry production represents the most unfair trade arrangement anywhere in the North American relationship. According to Trump, it acts like a hidden tax on American farmers. He called it a manipulated market, and he used a phrase that immediately ignited everything that followed: a deliberate act of agricultural theft against the United States. Mark Carney happened to be in the middle of a parliamentary question period when that post appeared online. An aide walked up and handed him a printed copy. Carney read it quietly for about 15 seconds, placed it down on the desk, and responded with something Washington likely didn't expect. Not anger, not defensiveness, not a carefully crafted diplomatic non-answer designed to avoid escalation. Instead, he answered with facts, clear, sourced, statistically precise facts delivered calmly in the measured tone of a former central banker who spent his career making high-stakes arguments to audiences that expect evidence rather than emotion. What followed during the next 30 minutes of that parliamentary session turned into one of the most striking exchanges in recent North American political history. The substance of what Carney said dismantled Trump's claims so thoroughly that even conservative Canadian economists later described it as one of the most effective trade policy rebuttals they had ever seen. To understand why this particular dispute matters so much, you need to understand the background. Dairy is not just dairy in this context. It has become a symbolic battleground for a much larger question: whether Canada has the sovereign right to organize its domestic economy according to its own values and priorities, or whether American export interests should be able to reshape Canada's market structure. Canada's supply management system dates back to the early 1970s. It covers milk, cream, butter, cheese, yogurt, chicken, turkey, and eggs. The framework works through three connected mechanisms. Production quotas control how much each farmer is allowed to produce. Import controls regulate how much foreign product can enter the Canadian market. And price controls stabilize what farmers receive for their output. The system was created with a specific goal, and, remarkably, it has delivered that outcome consistently for more than 50 years. Keeping Canadian family farms financially sustainable by ensuring the prices they receive actually cover the cost of producing food. Importantly, it is not a subsidy in the traditional sense. The Canadian government does not write direct checks to dairy farmers. Instead, it shapes the market structure so farmers can plan ahead, invest in equipment, and operate with a level of income stability that completely unmanaged commodity markets rarely provide. In practice, the results have been notable. Canadian dairy farms are mostly family-owned and family-operated. Many have remained in the same families for decades. Farmers are not extremely wealthy by national standards, but they tend to be financially stable, able to service loans, reinvest in their farms, educate their children, and retire with dignity. This stability is not accidental. It is the intended outcome of a policy that treats food production not only as a business, but also as a public good. Trump's criticism, however, is not really about consumer prices or pure trade fairness. The deeper issue involves market access for American dairy producers who operate under a completely different system. The American dairy industry is characterized by industrial-scale production, volatile commodity pricing, and a long-running problem of overproduction. That oversupply has contributed to waves of farm bankruptcies across the United States. Between 2003 and 2023, the United States lost roughly half of its dairy farms. American dairy producers often sell milk for prices that fall below the cost of production, surviving largely because of federal subsidy programs. In recent years, those programs have totaled more than $6 billion annually. In various support payments, The American system produces more milk per farm and operates on a larger scale, but it often does so through highly industrial operations that have reshaped rural communities across the Midwest and Northeast. When Carney responded in Parliament, he began calmly. He acknowledged that Canadian dairy policy was a legitimate topic for bilateral discussion. Canada, he said, had always been willing to talk about it. In the proper forum, meaning formal trade negotiations rather than social media posts. That line produced laughter from the government benches and an awkward silence from the opposition. Then Carney moved to the numbers. First, he pointed out that Canada already allows American dairy products tariff-free access up to specific quota limits. Those quotas were negotiated as part of the U.S.-Mexico-Canada Agreement, the trade deal that the Trump administration itself signed and frequently described as beneficial for American farmers. Under those provisions, the United States exports roughly $700 million in dairy products to Canada every year. That access exists because Canada agreed to it during negotiations. If Washington wants those quotas expanded, Carney said, the correct mechanism is another negotiation, not public accusations. Second, Carney highlighted that the United States supports its own dairy industry through federal subsidy programs, insurance systems, and other mechanisms that together represent billions of dollars in government assistance each year. The figure he cited: about $6.2 billion in direct and indirect federal support. Changed the tone of the entire discussion. Trump's claim was that Canada protects its farmers through supply management. Carney's response was simple. The United States protects its farmers too, just through a different method. Calling one system protectionist while describing the other as free market agriculture, he suggested, is not an economic argument. It is a political one. Third, Carney introduced comparative outcome data. Canadian dairy farm bankruptcies over the past 2 decades have been virtually non-existent. The system has not produced the massive closures seen elsewhere. Consolidation in Canada has occurred gradually, usually because farms pass between generations rather than collapsing financially. In the United States, by contrast, roughly 60,000 dairy farms disappeared during the same 20-year period. At one point, Carney looked directly toward the camera and remarked, calmly but unmistakably, that before a country lectures its neighbor about agricultural policy, it might want to examine whether its own system is actually working for its own farmers. The chamber erupted. Opposition members reacted loudly while government benches remained unusually quiet, an indication that the point had landed exactly where it was meant to. But Carney didn't stop there. He broadened the argument, linking the dairy dispute to a wider pattern of trade pressure that Canada has faced over the last 2 years. He argued that policies Washington labels as protectionist often have direct American equivalents described in entirely different terms. Canadian supply management becomes protectionism. American dairy subsidies become farmer support. Canadian steel protections become unfair barriers. American steel tariffs become national security. Canadian drug price regulation becomes market distortion. American patent extensions become innovation incentives. Canada, Carney said, is fully prepared to discuss any of these policies, as long as both countries apply the same standard TWACU to both economies. That framing changed the conversation. It suggested that the issue was not simply dairy, but a broader disagreement about how economic sovereignty is interpreted between the two neighbors. The reaction inside Canada crossed party lines. Conservative members of Parliament representing rural dairy districts, areas where supply management supports entire local economies, found themselves in the unusual position of having little to criticize in a Liberal Prime Minister's trade response. Farmer organizations praised the accuracy of Carney's numbers, while economists acknowledged that the comparison between Canadian farm stability and American farm closures was factually correct. Washington's response followed a familiar pattern. The White House described Carney's remarks as combative. The Office of the U.S. Trade Representative repeated its position that Canadian dairy barriers limit American exports. Trump himself posted additional messages repeating his earlier criticisms with stronger language but fewer specifics. No tariffs were announced. No new trade action was formally initiated. And that gap between escalating rhetoric and limited policy action may be the most important signal of all. Because this dispute is not really about dairy. It is about whether Canada will continue absorbing American criticism quietly, or whether it will now answer every accusation with detailed data and public comparison. The parliamentary exchange suggests that the old diplomatic habit may be ending, not replaced by hostility, not replaced by confrontation for its own sake, but replaced by something that may be more difficult for Washington to manage: calm, documented arguments delivered without apology. At the end of the day, the most powerful argument in a trade dispute is not the loudest one. It is the one that demonstrates, through clear numbers and measurable outcomes, that the critic's own system produces worse results by the very standards being applied. That is the argument Carney presented in Parliament. Officially, it was about dairy. In reality, it was about sovereignty, economic policy, and the rules governing how two neighboring economies challenge each other. So here is where things stand. Trump called Canada's dairy system agricultural theft. Carney responded with quota access numbers under the North American Trade Agreement, billions in American subsidy payments, tens of thousands of American dairy farm closures, and the near-zero bankruptcy rate among Canadian dairy farms over the same period. Washington called his response combative. Canadian farmers called it accurate. The facts themselves were never hidden. What changed is that Canada has now chosen to present them, loudly, clearly, and without apology, in the most visible form available.